Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? So welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you all and our speakers today. And I just wanted to mention that this is a seminar, part of the Food Equity Center seminar series, and we invite you to join the rest. And just to give you an overall plan of the seminar, Lydia is going to give a brief summary of the Building Back Better from Below project. And then Norma and Callum will talk about their research on community-led innovation and food system transformation. And then we'll hear from Sara and Ronald about their experiences in innovation in food and transformation of food systems. So here we have Callum Chapman, who is an alumni. He did his MA in food development, and he now is currently working for the Food Partnership. We got Norma Park, also an ex-student, and now is working for the Environment Agency. And we got Sara Fernee from Very Local Food Hubs, and Ronald Ranta from Fitzjohn's Community Food Project in Lewis. So Lydia, whenever you want.
About the project that informed and then clearly enable the connections with all of you and other organizations here in Brighton Hove and beyond. So this is a project that was funded by the Transatlantic Partnership. Alex Chapman in the room. He was the principal investigator in this project. Called Building Back Better from Below, and really focused on community innovation as well as policy innovation, but today's focus is on community innovation to address challenges faced by marginalized and racialized communities subjected to inequalities. So the context in which this project emerged was the COVID-19 pandemic. So at that point, we were really interested in finding out how communities innovate in responding to the challenges related to food insecurity that were felt at the time. But since then, the project continued. We hit a different type of crisis, the cost of living crisis, people really struggling to access affordable food, the right sort of food. So the project also looked at how communities responded to the new challenges that followed. It has focused on three different parts of the world, very different contexts. Brighton Hove, and this is the focus of today's seminar, São Paulo in Brazil, and Toronto in Canada, and looking at these different experiences with community innovation. Yeah. So this slide for the colleagues joining us online is giving you an overview of the project before Building Back Better from Below that enabled the research that we'll hear about shortly. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction to that, just to say that one of the project focused not only on food issues, but also health and political representation. Today we'll be focusing only on the food element. And one of the policy and practice goals, because this was an action research project very much focused on implications at the policy and for frontline workers. We wanted the project to help amplify the voices of community leaders and frontline service providers in debates about transforming food systems, and help to build coalitions for systemic changes that need to happen to overcome the challenges, the inequities facing marginalized and racialized communities. So I guess today is very much about showing that, about amplifying the voices of those who are innovating here in Brighton Hove and nearby, and having a discussion around how those innovations, how they encounter multiple challenges, but how they can enable broader, a wider food system transformation at local level.
So just a little bit of, so I've mentioned that the context in which the project emerged was the COVID-19 pandemic. The country was facing all sorts of challenges, of course, health-related and food-related as well. We've seen, if we actually look at the figures on food insecurity, it's quite interesting. If you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, this is a period where we actually see a drop in food insecurity in the UK. And it's then the period that follows the pandemic where you see the rise. And I think part of this is because there was a lot of community and otherwise responses to the fact that people weren't having access to enough food. So you've seen, there was a period of sort of very dynamic response going on at all levels of society, and that might have contributed to the picture. But then the food insecurity challenge really emerges in the context of the cost of living crisis. And this is also the context that, these projects that you'll hear about unfolded and have had to address. Another issue that I wanted to highlight here on looking at the right-hand side of this slide is the steady rise and quite significant rise in recent years of food banks in the UK as a sort of response to the food insecurity problem. So this is something that we've all getting used to, that food banks are addressing the challenge of food insecurity. But what you'll hear today is how other types of initiatives are trying to go beyond the food bank model and raising concerns around how people access food and how the stigma related to accessing food via food banks, and the need to talk about dignity and rights of everyone to have access to decent, healthy, nutritious diets. So you'll hear about the project, a sub-element of the project that I've mentioned, and the work that was carried out around innovation in food provisioning. And then you'll hear also about other initiatives. But on the first part, what the research supported by the B4 project, we published this working paper which synthesizes the work that we've done. The paper is called Transformative Change, or Towards Transformative Change, is asking whether these grassroots innovations are really moving us towards a significant change in local food systems. And in this paper, we try to address three questions. What are the grassroots innovations that are interesting here in Brighton Hove that emerged in this period? How they have emerged? What were the conditions that enable these innovations to come to being? What benefits they have generated to the community and often beyond food provisioning, and what challenge they have encountered? And then finally, it's the point around transformation. How are these innovations creating conditions for wider transformation in local food systems? And just very quickly to situate this work sort of conceptually, some of the guiding ideas that we used in the work. So, of course, a strong emphasis from the project on social innovation and new ways of doing, organizing, framing, and knowing that come from connections, relationships, from the ways people come up to solutions to problems. But then an emphasis on grassroots innovation. So this is not any type of societal innovation, but innovations that emerge from the grassroots through the work of activists, organizations, and networks that connect them, and how they generate bottom-up solutions that are embedded in, that are informed by what's going on in the communities. So you will hear examples of the sort of the benefits and the challenges that these types of innovations provide. They have sort of intrinsic benefits in the sense that they come from within the community. So they understand the communities and the problems that they face. Sometimes it's people struggling with access to food that are part of the innovation. They are innovators themselves. So this brings intrinsic benefits to the innovation. They face intrinsic challenges in the sense that they are ad hoc in a way. They struggle to access resources. They don't have infrastructures. They're like improvisations often to the situations that are occurring. So they face the challenges to maintain themselves, to organize themselves, and so on. And then we also talk about diffusion benefits and challenges. So in terms of diffusion benefits, what the literature tells us is how some of these grassroots innovations really envisage broader, wider societal change. So this connects then to the next concept, transformative innovation, that I'll mention. In terms of diffusion challenges, that because of their ad hocness, because of their lack of more sort of formal structures and rules, which are also their strength because they're flexible, but because of the lack of those structures and resources, they struggle to become bigger, to scale up, increase their size and their reach. And then, so finally, the concept of transformative innovation, which connects, as you can see, to what I've just presented, in the sense that it's looking at innovations that really try to change, alter, replace the dominant system, the dominant institutions. And that can be done in several ways: by improving the capacity of those involved in society, by contributing to the strengthening of networks that as well improve the capacity of and ability and agency of those involved, but also how these innovations can contribute to change the ways in which we look at food insecurity, food rights, access. So how they can contribute to changing norms and attitudes towards food and towards access to food, and potentially replace formal and informal institutions ultimately. So these were the sort of concepts that we were engaging with, and the stories that you'll now hear give you a sense of how that plays out in practice here in Brighton, by looking at first 3 case studies that we analyze in the Before project, and then we'll look at 2 other initiatives and hear directly from people involved in those initiatives of how they innovate and seek wider transformation. So I'll pass on to, is it Callum, to tell us a little bit about the methodology that guided the work.
So first of all, with the methodology, just to kind of outline how we chose the 3 projects, it was part of, there was a process of mapping initiatives across Brighton Hove with different variants of focuses, from redistribution, cultivation, focus on food insecurity, focus on sustainability. As you can see, the 3 projects we chose, which were Rock Farm, Brighton Food Factory and Chomp, all had different focuses. So with Rock Farm, it was production and local availability of food. With Brighton Food Factory, it's distribution and access to local food. And with Chomp, it was children's access and utilisation of food. We'll go in and discuss a little bit about what each of those projects work a little bit later on, but just to kind of outline the selection process. And also importantly, each of the projects existed before COVID, had significant challenges during COVID and into the cost of living crisis that they had to innovate and adapt to. And then all of the projects reverse back to their pre-pandemic activities, but with different focuses, different kind of tools and techniques that they learned through those crises and adapted. Their end goals were very similar to what they were pre-pandemic, but how they were going about them changed quite significantly. And then throughout the data collection methods for the research were 11 semi-structured interviews with key informants from the different projects. So that was staff members, including project managers, people that kind of run it on a more day-to-day basis, volunteers at each project, and then also a participant observation day as well. So that's it. Done.
Can you hear me okay if I speak into this? Okay, great. So me and Callum each took different kind of case studies to look at. And so one of them that I looked at was Rock Farm and also the Florence Road Market. So for those of you who don't know what Rock Farm is, I'll kind of just describe it a bit. It's essentially a market garden that exists about 30 kilometers outside of Brighton. And so it grows food, but also exists as kind of a therapeutic horticultural place as well, where vulnerable groups can go and kind of get access to nature, grow food. They call these service users, and there's also volunteers who just kind of go and grow food for the love of gardening as well. Rock Farm is under One Church, which is a socially justice-oriented church and charity organization. And it also falls with Florence Road Market, which also exists under the One Church kind of umbrella. And so Florence Road Market is in Brighton on Florence Road, and they sell produce from a variety of local vendors, and now including food coming from Rock Farm. So before the pandemic, Rock Farm was mostly this kind of therapeutic center where people could go and spend a nice day outdoors, gardening and kind of connecting with nature. They didn't really grow food as much for production. They didn't bring any of their food to the Florence Road Market, and most of their customers at the market were middle-class white people from Brighton, essentially, just because of its location and the high cost of this local food. They had tried to make it a bit more accessible. They had tried like advertising what they were doing and making it more accessible to people in the local community, but really struggled to kind of broaden out their customer base before COVID. And so what changed during the pandemic was there was a low availability of local produce. And so the demand kind of skyrocketed through the roof when the pandemic hit. People really wanted to get outside. They wanted local fresh produce, and they just didn't have enough food to meet this demand. And so what they decided to do, there's a huge waiting list for people to get the food from the market. They said, if you want to buy a vegetable box, you have to pay for two. So you have to double the price if you want to buy one. And using this extra money, they're able to then fund a box for local community projects. So the emergency food hubs that popped up during the pandemic, Chomp, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and just kind of making this food a bit more accessible for people. Also during this time, they had a lot more funding because a lot of funding was unlocked during the COVID pandemic. And so they were thinking ahead and use this funding to kind of scale up their production. I think they were making about £5,000 a year prior to the pandemic. And I think the year afterwards, they made about £19,000 through market production and just kind of scaling up, mostly growing lettuces that they could then sell at Florence Road Market. So that kind of led to their social enterprise model of being a bit more resilient to kind of various funding streams of from their charity model, and could then kind of fund their own work through the selling of their own produce, essentially. And this was also made possible through a lot more volunteers available during the pandemic, as well as just time when the farm was closed during lockdown. They just had time to kind of amp up their growing abilities, essentially. So I guess just to talk a bit about the benefits of all these innovations. So now the buy one, give one, or B1, G1 scheme is still active, and their production, again, is still kind of going strong. So part of the benefits, in addition to just making food more accessible, was breaking down that barrier between producer and consumer, kind of saying like, I either buy food or I make food, and people don't really know what happens on the in-between. So kind of empowering people to take a bigger role in seeing how food is grown by going to the farm, and then feeling more empowered to like receive that type of food as well. So it allows more vulnerable groups to have access to this local, nutritious, sustainably grown food, which, like I said, prior had mostly only been accessible to middle-class families. Through these boxes, it kind of broke down this idea that if you can't pay for food, then you'll get like just canned goods from the grocery store, the surplus. Like, you deserve to have this really high quality food as well, and this really sustainably grown food as well. So just kind of breaking down those perceptions of who should get which types of food was kind of a big benefit that came out of that. Yeah, and then in terms of the challenges, so once the pandemic ended, that kind of funding that had been unlocked, and all these volunteers who were, excited to get outside then started to go back to work. So they lost a lot of their volunteers as well as funding. And there's a lot of high competition for funding as well. Luckily, because of the way they had scaled up and getting the buy one, give one scheme initiated, they have been pretty resilient to these changes in funding. They're still going strong today, and doing a lot of these operations as well. But they have had trouble kind of scaling up, and they're still mostly within Brighton and Hove, and still trying to kind of reach more than just the middle-class communities who kind of frequent Florence Road Market. So they still lack that distribution infrastructure to become maybe wider transformative change. But the kind of, I guess, project manager, I would say, Ben, who works there, he kind of describes it as a ripple effect. So I guess that kind of goes into the transformative potential. As opposed to trying to change the whole system, I think what he's really trying to do is create this example of what could be an equitable and sustainable food system by showing different, I guess, growing projects that you can grow local food and you can make it more accessible. And this is how we're doing it. So not changing the whole system on their own, but that ripple effect of showing how it can happen and empowering other groups to do the same. Let's see. And I think the last thing I'll say, I touched on a lot of it already, but is just fostering that sense of collective agency for people, helping them get more involved in this kind of regenerative food system, getting them more involved in knowing where their food comes from, and seeing, just blurring those lines of what food is for which groups of people. Oh, and these are some photos. I did one day of volunteering on Rock Farm, and these are some photos I took while I was there. So I think I mentioned they're mostly selling lettuce bags. So that's kind of their main source of production and source of funding. So you can see kind of the rows, I think, in that middle picture there, and some of their other hoop houses as well.
And then Chomp, before the pandemic and after the pandemic, was a school holiday lunch club for low-income families that receive free school meals, usually during term time. So they were kind of a big benefit of the buy one gift one scheme that the Florence Road Market implemented, using veg from Rock Farm and also elsewhere as well, as they were the families that were the food. They were some of the families that the food boxes delivered to, the ones that usually attended the school holiday lunch club. So when the pandemic hit, during the pandemic, like I mentioned, it became necessary to still get families the food that they needed. And there was a lot of families struggling. And one of the big benefits with Chomp is that they had the connection with those low-income families already, established through their lunch clubs, and also through families that knew other families. And throughout the pandemic, at the very start, when there was lots of veg left over from the first Sorry, let me start again. So the Florence Road Market, when it first shut down during COVID, there was the first weekend they got the produce. There was lots and lots and lots of produce left over. They couldn't set their market up, so they had lots of surplus. So how they solved that was by delivering it to Chomp families, and then that kind of expanded on that. And then when people started returning to buy the veg boxes during the pandemic, when it was still in lockdown, they implemented a buy one gift one scheme, which was basically that people could pay for a box to be delivered to one of the low-income families that Chomp was supporting. And what it was really, kind of the benefits of Chomp really is that it supports low-income families to get food during periods where it's more difficult for them to access food. So when they're not at school, they obviously don't get their free school meals. And then also it applied during the pandemic as well, when they were struggling to access food. And also another big benefit of Chomp is that it kind of bolsters parents' confidence through they get a lot of the parents involved in the running of the sessions. So a lot of the parents are now volunteers. In fact, there's one parent that has now set up their own Chomp with the support of staff at the time. So they are still providing families in their children's school with meals as well. And also by using their networks. So for example, for those that don't know, Chomp is part of One Church. So by using their networks with One Church, they taken low-income families up to Rock Farm, showing them how the food is produced. And obviously that food was what they were receiving in their veg boxes as well. So it's really about connecting kind of families with the local food, how the local food was being produced, and kind of, bolstering their confidence and getting them more engaged in growing of food as well, and more engaged in running of the sessions. And then also as well, the Chomp project manager kind of really was saying how key Rock Farm was during the pandemic. They had a space to take families where they could social distance, they could get outside, they could still meet up in their groups that they were used to seeing, their friends, a lot of the children are friends, and there's friendships that are built through that. So it was really useful. And before the pandemic, they weren't using Rock Farm as much. There wasn't as much connection with how local food was being produced. There wasn't as much connection with those outside well-being spaces. So, and since the pandemic's ended, that still continued. There's still families going up to Rock Farm. There's still low-income families cooking up there, growing food, going up there, playing with hula hoops, doing outdoor activities. So it's really helped to connect low-income families that maybe aren't accessing outdoor spaces because they live in high-rise flats. They're really struggling to get to those outdoor spaces, and it still continued past that. Obviously, with a project the size of Chomp, they have 10 different Chomp locations across the city. 3 of them are directly run by Chomp staff members. Well, they were, but I'll come on to that. And then 7 of them are what they call satellite Chomps. So these are run by mostly volunteers at other community food projects across the city. And when the pandemic was happening, it actually wasn't as much of an issue, the funding, because they were receiving extra funding from their funders, and also there was lots of more support from volunteers and people willing to drive their cars for free, take the boxes to these low-income families. But when the pandemic ended and there was the cost of living crisis began, I mean, difficult to say when that exactly was, but when the cost of food started to increase exponentially, the cost of running a session for Chomp doubled. So basically how they were managing that was reducing staff time and reducing administrative time, which obviously reduces their chances to access more funding, apply for more funding, and access. And what's happened now, actually, since the research ended, is that the 3 members of staff that were permanent at Chomp, they weren't full-time, but they were permanent, have all had to leave their positions because of a lack of funding. So now the whole project is almost entirely reliant on volunteers and people doing ad hoc work when there's hours available to do that. So you see the kind of pandemic created challenges, but it also created opportunities for them in the sense that they had more volunteer time, they had a bit more funding, they had and they could deliver this food and take the families outside. And actually, since the pandemic's ended, there's actually been more significant challenges for them as a project, and that's kind of really kind of counterproductive to what you'd think it would be for a project the size of Chomp. And then kind of in terms of its transformative potential, obviously with Chomp, it is focusing on just feeding families on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis, or on a school holiday to school holiday basis. So their goal was never to make wider system change, but by collaborating with other projects like Rock Farm, like Florence Road Market, and their connection to the affordable food other affordable food projects in the city, they have exposed low-income families to local food systems, to help them access outdoor spaces, help them connect more with local produce, delivered local produce directly to their door, and challenge the ideas that outdoor spaces and high-quality food spaces are not for those low-income families, not for those marginalized communities. And then obviously as well, the project is still going without those staff members, and that kind of really shows the resilience that they've created in their community. They've got volunteers that are willing to do it, and a lot of those volunteers are the parents from those low-income families that maybe now some of them find themselves in a bit of a better situation than they were, but also still are volunteering, or some of them have always volunteered, or they've come to one Chomp session, their kids have had a nice activity, they've done an arts and crafts activity, but then they've had a nice meal, but then the next time they come, maybe they get involved in the kitchen a bit more, or if it's just helping out with the plates the first time, and just kind of getting parents involved slowly, step by step, building up that relationship, and then gives them the confidence. And as an example, there is now one parent that set up their own Chomp completely from scratch. And then a lot of the other ones, the volunteers that now run them on a school holiday basis, are those same parents from the low-income families.
Okay, great. So next I'll talk about the other case that I looked at, which was the Brighton Food Factory. So this one's interesting because the idea behind the Brighton Food Factory is actually very different to what it ended up doing during the pandemic and afterwards. So originally, the founder of the Brighton Food Factory had envisioned a big kind of physical space in Brighton where local gleaned and surplus food could kind of all be stored, and then kind of processed and maybe redistributed as ready meals to low-income families throughout the city, because he saw that a lot of times it was this distribution network that was kind of locking or preventing this food from being accessible, because you have to pay all these vans and all the fridge space. It's quite expensive. And so his idea was to have a community funded place where all the food could kind of go and then be redistributed from there. He had set up the company, but had not kind of taken any further steps when the pandemic hit in terms of actually buying this physical property. It kind of never came to fruition. When the pandemic hit, he was asked by, I think, the Brighton Hove Food Partnership to help deliver food from local farms to kind of these emergency food hubs. And so it quickly became less of this kind of more, I guess, innovative, like system-wide transformative organization, and more of a very like meeting direct needs during the pandemic of a food delivery service. And part of that was because the founder saw that, farms were having food just rotting in the fields because there wasn't people there to harvest them during the lockdown, because people couldn't go and work on the farms. And so his kind of goal was to save this food that was kind of in the fields on farms and get it to low-income families. And that's exactly what happened. They used vans and storage facilities from a previous food distribution business that him and his partner had, and they kind of just were able to bring this local, fresh, sustainably grown food to the emergency food hubs, Chomp, as well, and just places throughout the city during the pandemic. So yeah, quite different from what they had originally sought to do, but we're able to kind of adapt quickly, and within a few days or even a week, we're able to quickly become this new food delivery service. So part of the benefits of this is kind of similar to what I was talking about with Rock Farm, where it kind of challenges who deserves to have access to this food. So very similarly, it was getting local, nutritious, sustainably grown food to communities who might not normally have had access during the pandemic, and kind of changing that idea around who should be eating this food and what kind of food should be donated, I guess, to these kind of vulnerable groups. Another benefit is the legacy behind the idea of Brighton Food Factory. Even though it never came to fruition, it has started conversations among other kind of community groups as to what could this distribution network look like? How could we kind of work together to make local food more accessible? After the pandemic, Brighton Food Factory tried to kind of transition to a social enterprise model where they would be taking this gleaned and surplus food and selling it at a higher cost to certain shops around town, and then using that money to then donate a certain amount of food to other farmers. So they were buying food from farms, selling it, and hoping to then use that excess money from selling it to give the food at cost to community groups. Unfortunately, with the cost of living crisis, it was just really difficult for local community groups or local like markets even, to pay this higher premium cost of food, even knowing the social good behind it. They were just kind of struggling to survive themselves. So the social enterprise wasn't very successful, and when funding failed after the pandemic, they had to close and cease like operations. So Brighton Food Factory no longer exists. It existed from about 2019 to 2022, I believe. So the challenges that I face in terms of funding and volunteer time and working within this kind of capitalist market really forced them to close in the end. Were insurmountable. But I think the main transformative potential that came from this was, one, again, these kind of conversations that are around what could that type of factory look like? How could we empower a distribution network that makes this type of local high quality food more accessible to people? And then there are conversations around this already. And it also helped create those networks between, for example, the Brighton Hove Food Partnership and different organizations with local farmers who might not have had that connection with community food projects prior to the pandemic. So that transformative potential really stemmed from creating relationships and building networks and kind of getting ideas off the ground, even though the food factory is not actually in existence anymore. So now I'll just kind of go over some of the main conclusions that we found from these 3 case studies and in the B4 study. So just to start, we saw that crisis, and in this case, COVID-19 pandemic and the cost of living crisis, was really a catalyst for change and innovation. It kind of suspended norms and changed the rules of operations, whether that was, we have excess volunteers, people aren't actually going into their 9-to-5 job anymore. We have an excess amount of money. There's a social distancing, which maybe makes more projects like Rock Farm more accessible and intriguing for people to have that time outside. So that crisis really was a catalyst and a force for change, and kind of allowed people to operate outside of the kind of normal standard operations. And all of these different organizations were really embedded in the community. So working with local groups and really seeing what the need was immediately. And as such, they were able to adapt really quickly, often within days or weeks, changing their operations, changing how they do things to get food to where it's needed, because they, better than anybody, really could see where the food was needed and had to get it there. And this, as I've mentioned, has really improved food equity and access in the sense that it changed the norm of where this type of food is going and who's eating this kind of food. It did have structural limitations. So while the embeddedness and its small scale and its integration in the local community was a strength in some areas, you can also see how relying on volunteers and being a small scale and having funding constraints also made it quite difficult to sustain itself financially in the long run. Some models did better than others, such as Rock Farm and Chomp, to a lesser extent with the lack of staff, and then others just were not able to push past those funding constraints. And there's also concern in terms of scaling challenges and what that means for transformative potential. I think the question is, are, what changes are these projects making on the broader food system? People are still, mostly shopping at Tesco's and Aldi. I don't know if it's necessarily like revolutionized the way that people in Brighton get their food, but it has kind of changed in terms of creating more networks, adding an educational piece, and changing the conception around this kind of food and where it should be going. But still, in terms of changing like the wide scale international agri-food system, it can be quite limited in that because of its small model, of course. And in terms of a path forward, so we didn't look at this as much in the paper, but looking at ways that we could scale up while still preserving this community ethos and like challenging these broader systems while still preserving that embeddedness that we saw in these cases, and looking at different policies and how these could support this kind of impact as well. So we didn't kind of dive into the policy side of things, so that would be really interesting for the research that we felt. Yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Callum and Norma. That was brilliant. We'll now hear about two additional experiences, one just across the road from us and the other one further afield in Lewis. Before we go there, we wanted to show a short video, so if Kieran can help us. And those joining us online can access the video that we'll share through the link that we'll share in a second. So this is a video that features Ben, whom we've heard about. Ben works for One Church here in Brighton. He's really the driving force behind Rock Farm, as well as Florence Road Market. In this video, he's telling us a little bit more about what goes on in Rock Farm. But importantly, those connections that are being established with other projects across the city. So here, very local food hubs is being mentioned as a destination of some of the really nice food that they grow, the salads and other products that they grow in Rock Farm. So the theme of connections across projects comes very strongly here. So let's hear what Ben has to say, and then Sara will continue. The local food system. So Sara, over to you, and welcome again.
Can you tell me, can you hear me all right? Is that, yeah, okay. So thanks for having me. There's a few different people connected to very local food hubs in the room, which is reassuring because it's a bit scary. So that was a good introduction to what we're doing. Basically started in the pandemic looking at people's access to fresh food, and developed a local veg box scheme where people would volunteer to help put together veg boxes and then help distribute them in a very specific area. So it's in the east side of Lewis Road. So it's basically Bevendine, Moulscombe and Bates Estate, which is very close to here. And so the location is important because the people that came together to run this project all kind of lived in the area, all connected to the area. We knew the needs well. We knew, we had we knew what our neighbours were struggling with. We had experience, we had lived experience basically. And what kind of connected us was connections with other local groups and spaces too. So there were like community leaders in different ways, whether they were running community gardens or connected with schools or youth projects, churches, that kind of thing. So we came together very quickly in response to the first lockdown and started to think about what could we do to help the food insecurity in the area, because it already existed. We already had a CHOMP in place that was kind of acknowledging that we had a high proportion of kids on free school meals, that there was food insecurity. I was working at a community garden and just running a forest school and working with families, and noticing that when we were outside and eating together, people would talk about food issues, like whether it was confidence to cook, knowledge about what was seasonal, or actually just not being able to access good resources, fresh food affordably. And that was what the community garden on a very small scale was helping to address. And then in the pandemic, we knew that access to fresh food was going to get worse, basically. It's a really hilly area if you've not been. And so that's one of the challenges, that like access to a supermarket, if you haven't got transport, is, you know, you're lugging potatoes up a big hill, for example. There were lots of people with, there's health inequality in the area too. So lots of people suffering health challenges, social isolation, having caring responsibilities, all those kinds of things that impact your access to food, and an over-reliance really on supermarkets because the local shops didn't provide affordable fresh food. So from the very beginning, we were working, local people working together to try and solve their own issues and help the neighbours. So there was that kind of real push to come together, as I know a lot of projects did. But there was also a kind of look at not being the emergency food response. We couldn't help people that were in absolute crisis that needed free food, but looking at what the next step is. So where people could afford to pay a bit, then providing a service where they could choose what they paid. So we've always had a scaled pricing system. And at the moment that is, so for the same size veg box, you can pay £5, £10, £18 or 23. And we estimate that the value of the veg in the box is about 18. So if you pay 23, you're paying it forward to support somebody else's veg box. But yeah, a huge box of fruit and veg that's supposed to last a fortnight for as little as £5. So that, you know, is a really useful local resource and much better than any of the local shops could provide. Just to give you an example, a lot of the local shops have, you know, like oranges or apples wrapped in plastic in a set of 4 that might have sat on the shelf for 2 months and not be sold. Not very good options, basically. And we really tried to give people enough to kind of to meet the needs to produce meals through a week, and also to give like really high quality produce. So that, you know, working with suppliers to make sure that it was food you would choose in a supermarket or choose to buy rather than surplus or dregs or, you know, close to date things. So it started off very small. Initially, we were doing like 16 deliveries a week. We're now doing like 75, and we're reaching about 250 people a fortnight in terms of feeding them. And there's different proportions. So the proportion of people paying the different amounts has changed over time too. So that's been an interesting thing to track. But we've been applying for funding basically to support the subsidized boxes. And there has always been more people accessing the subsidized prices than the at cost or pay it forward prices. Yeah, so it's developed quite quickly, but then it's also helped build networks locally, because we started with some local networks in terms of local activists, and then also work with people that wanted to be able to help their area, their community. And so the kind of volunteer base has kind of built over the years, and it's not just been about a veg box delivery. We've done like pop-up workshops around growing and cooking together. We've done feasts at farms. We do trips to Rock Farm regularly. We've connected with lots of different food organisations, including Chomp and Rock Farm and other farms locally, and really kind of tried to develop our sourcing as well throughout. So now we're working with quite a range of local farms, and that's an ongoing kind of work in progress. We work with Fork and Digget at Stanmer, just literally down the road. We work with Lovebrook, which is at Kingston, Rock Farm, High Bun, which they've actually stopped growing veg now because they had so many pressures. So I can explain a little bit about that later. And Lanes, which is just a little bit further afield, but basically all within Sussex. We also work with a local greengrocer who sells at the open market, and so our veg isn't all local and organic, because actually providing enough food to keep people sustained over a week is tricky. We've been doing this kind of tightrope balancing between sustainable food and keeping people well fed and meeting a need around food poverty. So where we can, it's local and sustainable, but also, you know, including fruit, for example, has been a really key thing. And we've got lots of feedback from families that it's really helpful to include fruit because that's the thing that they can't afford. And so like we always include apples and, you know, oranges, bananas, those kinds of things. And obviously you can't grow bananas here. So we try and keep the local food as seasonal as possible, and we try and get British grown food from the grocer as well. But we do have some imported food too. And so that, again, that's a balance. So trying to keep the variety so people's diets can be varied, but also balance all the costs is a challenge. Yeah, so I think in summary, the things that we do and continue to do is try and bring local food into the local area. We have like developed networks across our specific area and beyond. So we've got like connections here and are trying to kind of amplify what we're doing in ways that we can, and also have those conversations about the local growers need support. It's the very small scale farms that we're working with, and actually it's such a challenge. So we're trying to generate those conversations with the people that are accessing the veg boxes about the challenges of growing food locally and connect them to growers. And that Soil in the City project was part of that, and it's developed further. We're also trying to talk to people about what they want and need from the local food system, because, you know, with busy lives, the reliance on supermarkets and things, actually, you know, thinking about the ethics and sustainability around food is a privilege, you know, or it can be. And so actually creating time and space to talk about the stuff that matters to us. And then in doing that, kind of building community and, you know, food really matters to people. If you create spaces where you can talk about it, that, you know, that really shows. And so we've really tackled quite a lot of kind of isolation issues as well, and empowered and supported people that are connected with us to upskill, whether that's being able to share the skills they have with other people, or learn new ones, get more confident cooking things from scratch, get more confident actually trying to grow those tomato plants on your windowsill and going, if it's failed, actually knowing that it didn't work with your neighbour too, gives you a bit of faith that you haven't done everything wrong. Those kinds of things. And actually building skills around, you know, food supply and distribution, those kinds of things. So quite a few of our people have like maybe, we've got some really lovely examples of where somebody maybe came to a food fair that we ran, which kind of showcased the different things that we do, all completely free, lots of eating together, lots of different examples of how local food has an impact, whether it's foraging or food growing spaces, that kind of thing. So they might have come to that event and then seen that we're doing a trip, and then come on a trip to Rock Farm, and then gone, oh, you're doing a veg box, we'll sign up to the veg box. And then joined a local forest school as well. So then going to the community garden weekly. So and then kind of got involved in helping us run things, you know. So there's some really good examples of people that got involved in a very small way, kind of developing that experience with us and sticking with us and supporting us in ways that they can. So we always ask people, you know, what would you like to do with us? What can you, how can you contribute? What, and what do you need, you know, and trying to keep listening to that. And I think the founding members and people that have kind of joined along the way have all really upskilled. You know, I knew nothing about veg distribution before this project. It was not my thing. Community engagement was my thing. So, you know, I've learned a lot about the value of parsnips and, you know, all sorts of random things. So yeah, there's been learning in lots of informal ways, as well as yeah, so we've all been upskilling basically, and there's more and more opportunities to do that. And I think we will go on to some of the challenges, because I've told you like the good things, but there are challenges to running something like this from very small and building it up. But there's also like a lot of opportunity to be agile, as you were talking about earlier, to actually respond to the needs on the ground. So, you know, we've been able to kind of listen and act quite quickly, where I know bigger organizations have struggled to be as responsive. And, you know, so people saying, what do we do with this veg? You know, we've got a glut of beetroot in the food bank. So we've worked, sorry, I didn't say that before, but we worked very specifically with the existing local food organisations from the outset too. So with Bevendine Food Bank, and then with a new community pantry that happened in Bevendine, and with Chomp. And we listened to what the needs were there. So people were avoiding some of the veg because they didn't know how to use it. So then we ran pop-up workshops at those spaces with chefs, showing them 10 tasty things you can do with this, you know, and sharing recipes and that kind of thing. So we were able to listen and act quite quickly. And I think that is one of the advantages of being grassroots and community-led.
Thanks, that was really inspiring. Thank you very much. Moving quickly to our last speaker, Ronald Runta. You've been here before several times, so
do I need the mic or?
You'll need the mic for people online.
Okay, I'll use the mic.
Thank you for.
So my name is Ronald Ranta. I am both representing Fitzjohn's Community Food in Lewis, and I'm also a co-founder of the Alliance for Dignified Food Support. I need to start by saying I feel a bit of an outside here, both because I represent a project in Lewis, not in Brighton, and it's not connected to the B4 project, and it's more of a front-facing food insecurity initiative. So what does Beyond Food Bank look like? There's a whole debate in the UK now about beyond food banks. We got so institutionalized in the idea of food banks, so what comes afterwards? And I'll talk a little about what we've done and what this model looks like. But I guess a note of caution, I'm very weary of overselling the innovative and aspiring things we've done, given that I know that the biggest problem we're facing is one that we can't solve, and that's poverty. So there's many, many issues we're trying to address: loneliness, poverty. We can do a lot to support people, but there's also a limit to what we can do. Basically, we're trying to solve a problem that we haven't created and that we cannot solve. So take that into account. So we're based in Lewis. And apparently a day or two ago, The Guardian came up with this article saying that Lewis is the happiest and among the best places to live in the UK. And I think that's true for most of the people in Lewis. It is, in terms of affluency, it's pretty affluent town. But most of our members probably would not feel that. And there's also particular challenges, and I think it's also true to Brighton. Living in poverty amid affluency is often more challenging than living in poverty amidst poverty, because local services are not always geared towards your issues. Anecdotally, I was in a different meeting this morning, and one of the people I know well said that she went to a meeting about housing shortages in Lewis, and all the discussions were about things which didn't really affect people who rent or live in temporary accommodation, because those were the needs of probably the majority of or a large proportion of the population. So what does Beyond the Food Bank look like? During the pandemic and towards the end of the pandemic, the beginning of what we call the cost of living crisis, our numbers start rising quite dramatically. More and more people are in food insecurity, either temporarily or ad hoc, or permanently in food insecurity. Pre-pandemic, most people who use food banks, there's a lot of debates about that. A lot of people who use food banks need them temporarily, or use them only for a number of times throughout the year. Otherwise, they manage without them. We're seeing more and more since the pandemic, people needing long-term support. Every single week, every other week. It's not coming in for 4 or 5 times as a solution. In the past, if you wanted to go to a food bank, you went to a social subscriber, a GP, a social worker, you got vouchers for a food bank. Normally, there'd be between 3 and 6 vouchers, because the expectation was you'd go there 3 or 6 times, get some support. Support was normally a boxed or fixed long shelf life ingredients that should last you for 3 days. So 3 to 6 times, food for 3 days, then you'll find another job, you'll get your benefits, problem solved. Now it's increasingly clear that it doesn't support most of the people who need that support. We currently support around 16 households every single week. Numbers varying depend on the time of the month, but also the time of the year. we have around 110 people on our books registered. We use the term members rather than service users because the model we've adopted is one which is about community-based, but also about membership. So what we do is we try to find a solution that both addresses those who need emergency support. So if you come to us first time, we accept self-referrals. You don't have to have any referral. We'll support you for 6 weeks if you want for free, giving you all the services we provide for members. After 6 weeks, we move members if they need that support, and most of them do need that support, to if you want a membership or subscription model where they pay £3.50 to access all of our services. What are our services? So one of the most important things is recognizing that food is an important element. That's why people come in, but it's not the main reason. People have needs that need to be met, a lot of them about managing in very, very difficult circumstances. So in terms of food, we run something like a social supermarket. We'll go in and you can buy produce, you can choose what you want, and choice is very important, both in terms of our model, but also in terms of a dignified system of providing food support. So you'll come in, you'll do your shop, you'll pay £3.50 for that. The ingredients you'll get for £3.50 are normally worth 10 times that amount. We have a huge emphasis on fresh produce and essentials. So milk, eggs, bread, and fresh produce. You'll also have what you normally see in other food support organizations, and that's long shelf life produce. Now, in addition to that, we've also put a community cafe. So we use surplus and we cook surplus. So if you come in, you'll get a hot meal. In the winter, there might also be a soup. In the summer, might be a salad. There might be cakes, coffee and tea, biscuits, both in order to give an additional support to people who come in, but also people sometimes come in because they're lonely. And that's open to the entire community. You don't have to be a member of Fitzjohn's to come into the cafe. In addition to that, in terms of addressing the kind of more holistically address some of the problems, we have a paid community navigator who works with members to try to see if there's anything additional we can do or if any additional support that they could access. So trying to navigate the systems. For many people, navigating is not sufficient, but it's a first step. And anyone who has to deal with social services or any kind of authority knows that navigating the system often is one of the most complicated things. Where is the information? Who do I need to speak to? What am I entitled to? What can I access? We also provide for a community navigator a hardship fund. So another mechanism of support for which we fund separately, if people have emergency needs that need to be addressed, and we can address, and these could be small things for £50 to £200-300, we could or might, depending on the situation, be able to address those. As you can imagine, the need for this hardship fund is much bigger than the actual amount we can actually provide. But again, it's another thing to support our members. In terms of transformative power and what are we trying to do? So one of the most important things is recognizing that until there is a better solution, we need to come up with something which gives people choice. It's more dignified, tries to at least address some of the problems more holistically, but also empowers members. So we engage with our members constantly. The model we came up with is based on consultation with our members. We constantly listen to them. There's small things where people might not think about, things like queuing, or what's the order in which people can come in, which have been a huge issue because think about queuing, people might not want to be seen queuing to come into a food support organization. So how do you manage queuing? Who should be a volunteer? How should they address people? We've tried to look at additional things we could support our members. So we encourage them to be volunteers. So they're also part of what we do, as opposed to just simply what people would think of as passive service users. Particularly in our community kitchen, most of the people in the kitchen are themselves members of Fitzjohn's. And we've worked to upskill them, thinking about both food and hygiene certificates, cooking skills, something they could take afterwards with them if they wanted to do that. But also coming up with a model which is to an extent sustainable. I'm saying to an extent because it all relies on donors and funding, but it could also be replicable for other organizations to follow. Now, this thing about being agile, yes, I think being grassroots means we're a lot more agile. but there's also a limitation to our agility because we have a fixed space, we have volunteers, we work 1 day a week, 2.5 hours on that day. And if we change things, we have to be very careful about how we change things. So for example, if I go back to queuing, if we change our queuing system, members will be like, that's the first thing they will notice that's changed, and they might not want that. So when we are, the agility has to come first through consultation and engagement, rather than simply trying to kind of see a problem and solve it straight away. And I think the biggest transformative element is trying to persuade, advocate, and campaign for the fact that food insecurity is not about food. In some countries, this is an issue of food. There isn't enough food. There is enough food. Most of our members use supermarkets. The issues they need addressed are the fact that most of them don't have the purchasing power to access the food that is around them. And how can we support them in that? And I'm happy to talk about challenges in more detail. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. So those are really interesting and inspiring stories. Thank you very much. And I guess the question that I wanted to ask you, two interrelated questions. So one is, what are the challenges that you are encountering and how can you overcome them? And the other is, I think out of the B4 project, there was this strong sense that in order to best respond to an epidemic, you need to have a social infrastructure in place. And the places that had best outcomes were where those social infrastructures were well developed, where there was the networks of organizations, a rich civil society, well-developed networks between organizations. So I guess my question is, and now from what I hear, there seems to be like an undermining of that infrastructure that existed during COVID and before. So I guess my question is, what is needed from donors, from local authorities and the state at large to support the social infrastructure to enhance that resilience that we were talking about before? So those two questions, something about challenges and how to address them, and then something about the broader system and what can be done to support these kind of initiatives. Would you like to start, Sara?
Yeah, I can do it. So definitely kind of funding consistency has been a huge one for us. We, although we do a model where people can contribute financially to what they're receiving, the demand for subsidized boxes is definitely higher than the veg boxes where people can pay the cost or pay it forward. And what we've really found is that the funding landscape is really inconsistent. So you get very short-term funds or you might get a lot, but you have to spend it within 3 months, or you can put a lot of effort and time into writing funding applications. You can get nothing back, and then something else that you've put an equal amount of time into might fund you for a year, and it's really hard to kind of gauge that and to plan forward when that's the case. So we were talking about it a little bit between us earlier, that just having the trust as a grassroots entity that is doing like amazing work on the ground, we need the trust from policymakers and from local council and from other bigger organizations that we are able to deliver, and the trust to fund us for a 3-year stint and say, what can you do, and we'll work with you and we'll support you through that process, rather than prove to us what your outcomes are going to be, and we'll give you this little bit of money now, and then there'll be a long gap, and then we'll give you another little bit. It's sort of drip feeding funding rather than that longer term or even midterm look at things. So that is definitely been a big challenge, because there's been times where we know we're having a really positive impact on our local community. We can prove it. We haven't often got the time to evidence what we're doing. So actually that's where working with universities and working with students from IDS and things, helping us kind of evidence what we're doing to be able to tell that story effectively, is one of our challenges, just in terms of time capacity. But But yeah, we can. We'd like to have the support and the trust to be able to push things to build on what we're doing rather than have to be start-stop. So there's been times where we've been running a project, we know it's gone well, the funding has come to an end, other funding hasn't come in time, and we've had to pause. And that's just really frustrating, you know, where we know the need is there and we know we can meet that need. But yeah, so that I mean, you'll hear that from a lot of different projects. But I think one of the other challenges is that the differentiation between food banks and affordable food schemes. And there are quite a lot of affordable food projects that came out through COVID in Brighton, and there are lots of them across the country. But there's not so much kind of public awareness about the differences and the fact that the affordable food projects give a kind of more sustainable approach to addressing food insecurity, basically. So it would and some solutions around bringing localized food, you know, locally grown food into deprived areas, those kinds of things. So where a food bank is addressing an emergency need in the very short term, an affordable food project has kind of participation from members. They're helping each other. It can be long term. It can build up skills and local resilience. So that there's quite a big difference, but there's a lack of local awareness around that. And then that kind of translates into maybe a lack of support. So we have some members that pay it forward, but we would like to build that. And I think the local awareness around those differences would be useful. And again, as a small entity, being able to kind of self-promote on that front is tricky, and reach people that can afford to pay it forward, and for them to know it's for them too, not just. So we're reaching lots of different target groups, basically. Yeah, I think that's probably enough. But, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, there are many challenges. I'll talk about two, but I'm happy to kind of discuss more in depth in the Q&A. I guess the first one, I guess both of them are ironic situation that we find ourselves in. The first one is, on the one hand, food supports as a concept, which encompasses food banks, veg schemes, affordable food clubs, are not part of any official government system. The government actually does not have a strategy of addressing food insecurity, but unofficially, we are part of the welfare system. Yeah. We're not funded as such. We're not trained as such, even though volunteers have to deal with very vulnerable population in very difficult circumstances. And I'm happy again to talk about volunteers in the Q&A, because there's a lot of really interesting things, particularly about volunteers in the sector. The sector relies completely on volunteers. Without them, the whole sector collapses. So on the one hand, we're not funded properly, but we are the first line of support in addressing food insecurity. And the government knows it because they do provide funding, but not enough. So this situation has to be resolved one way or the other. Either the government says, well, we don't fund this stuff. This is civil society. These are charities. Or, yes, this is an essential service that we require, and therefore we'll fund it accordingly. Or we will come up with a better solution to food insecurity from the start and fund that. The second irony is this issue of food. Where does the food come from? And it has been this idea, which might make sense in other countries, but not in the UK, that surplus food is the solution to food insecurity. Now, conceptually, there's a problem, because some have pointed the idea of left behind food, even though I fully agree most surplus food is not left behind food, but the idea, the concept, left behind food for left behind people. In this country, we do not produce enough food for there to be enough food surplus to provide for all those who suffer from food insecurity. And also, since the cost of living crisis and the rising of food prices, there is less food surplus available. Now, a lot of organizations are trying to find more surplus, and it's very, very commendable. And cutting food waste, again, is very commendable. But we now know that this surplus is not sufficient to address the levels of need, and the numbers or the quantity is further being reduced. So most food organizations, food banks included, have to rely on donations, food people leave at supermarkets, or money that comes in through donors or funding, and to buy the food themselves. So we have to buy the food to provide it as a subsidized food. This might not be the best, I think, as an economist, efficient way of addressing food insecurity. And it's difficult for us as an organization to manage that.
Thank you very much. Would you like to, Norma and Callum, would you have any insights on challenges from the case studies that you studied?
I think the challenges are kind of very similar to what have been discussed already, especially with Chump specifically, with the challenges of, you know, funding after the pandemic has gone down massively, and essentially the Chump project, as I mentioned, now relies almost entirely on volunteers and a small amount of hours to run. And obviously it's very commendable that they can keep 10 projects across the city still going and feeding low-income families. But if they had, you know, kind of that a bit more funding that they had during the pandemic even, or kind of still had access to that local food that they could give out to families, you know, to help cut the cost of each session, you know, if they had that extra funding and that long-term funding that Sarah was talking about, where it's, you know, a couple of years in advance instead of just, oh, here's enough to run projects for the summer holidays. If they had that long-term funding, then they could plan ahead. They could make, one of the members of staff at Chump told me about how they're trying to make connections with local suppliers more, how they're trying to get local greengrocers involved. If they had that long-term planning ahead, they could make, you know, deals with them in the long term, where it's like, can you provide us this food for a year, for the next year? Can we plan ahead? Can we think how we want to maybe expand on the Chumps or get more families even more involved in it, in the decision making? But because it is just here's funding for 3 months, here's funding for 6 months, you know, at a maximum, really, you're always up against it. You're always just adapting as soon as you get the funding. Oh, we need to quickly put on 6 Chumps in this next 2-week holiday because we've not planned ahead, because the funding is just coming in at that last minute. So I think that really that secured long-term funding would be so much better for them to plan ahead and really make decisions in the long term, and, you know, like I say, make even more secure connections with local suppliers as well.
Can I interject a little bit? I just, something that we haven't really talked about too much, but we're talking about volunteers. But in one of the things that we've been doing, and I think it's relevant to the Chump situation too, is not relying just on volunteers, but having paid roles. And that's something we decided quite early on, that we need to have some paid roles for consistency. It obviously supports people in the local area in terms of employment and training, that kind of thing, but it also helps like retain the skills and develop the skills. But what we've found is, because where things have been sort of more short term and less kind of mid-term or long-term funded, or we haven't been able to plan, so we've actually like upskilled people, and then they've actually had to move on to more secure employment, rather than being able to have trained, experienced staff stay with us and develop and build on there. So you lose capacity each time that happens, each time that kind of cycle continues. So the Chump staff too, I know, you know, they built up loads of expertise and loads of relationships and connections, and then that gets lost when the funding drops out. So having key people, it doesn't take an awful lot of resource to maintain, you know, a baseline staffing basically, and I think that's really important for consistency and sustainability.
Thanks, Norma.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the challenges that you all mentioned about funding and volunteering. And I guess I'll just touch on one other one that came up with our conversation with Ben that me and Callum had from Rock Farm. And that is some of the social barriers to kind of, I guess, improving access to some of this fresh, local and sustainable food for different vulnerable groups. Ben had said that before the pandemic, there was affordable housing near Florence Road Market, and they had done flyers. They had really tried to push like, oh, come to this market, like, you can pay at lower cost and access some of this food. And it just was really a struggle to actually get people there. They just didn't feel that was for them. They didn't really know how to cook some of the foods. it just wasn't their community or people they wanted to be around, I guess, because of those like social barriers that people felt. So I think part of the food box idea was to bring the food to them. But yeah, it's also important, I guess, as Sarah was talking about, teaching people how to cook this food, maybe creating, like Ronald was saying, places like cafes where like different classes of people are like sitting together in one coffee shop, for example. So I guess just that kind of social stigma around it, and seeing what you feel is for you and what spaces you feel welcome and safe and happy and to be around.
Fabulous, thanks, Norma. And I was going to say that as part of the B4 project, we also had a series of meetings around affordable food projects. I think a lot of good insights came from that. But I can't remember why I was mentioning that. But we'll be sharing that in any case. Oh, and it was a discussion that we had amongst the participants around this infrastructure of distribution. That's something that can be supported from the council, that is doable, and that there's ways of how do you link these local producers with the distribution systems that exist, with the grassroots organizations that are in touch with the members or the service users. So there's definitely something that can be done, and there was those discussions were initiated then. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. Alex, shall we take two more? Yeah. So let's start with Alex, and maybe someone online has a question. Oh, Nick as well.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, sorry, my name's Alex. I, as Lydia mentioned, I had the privilege of being PI of the B4 project. And yeah, just amazing hearing about this work. Obviously, reading about it, been reading about it for a couple of years, but actually hearing about it in person, some of these reflections really, really powerful and just amazing work. But I did want to pick up on this, the point that this was a study that looked at Brighton and Hove, but it also looked at São Paulo and Toronto, and some of these comparative reflections that emerged. And obviously, Santi, Lydia, others who were involved in that may also have reflections, and that included visits, right? So we had people from our partners in São Paulo and Canada coming to Rock Farm on a visit and engaging with several of the projects. And one of the things that struck me was about a theme that's come up across all of what you've been sharing, which is about the role of volunteers and members, and this idea of people becoming engaged. And I've heard some wonderful stuff about how people learn, how people gain confidence, how people grow their networks, but I haven't heard about political collective action. And as someone who works mainly on Brazil, you know, they go straight to the social movement option. So our partners in Brazil, so we had the MTST, the Homeless People's Movement from São Paulo, the people who run their community kitchens came to Rock Farm on their visit, and they were part of these conversations. Yeah, so they went to the very local food hubs, and they've been part of these exchanges. The MTST, which is a movement of very marginalized people, they do their outreach through these community kitchens, but also through people self-organizing to claim land and self-build housing. But they do it with a project of building, if you like, mass collective power. And they elected one of their leaders to the national parliament, and they were able to pass legislation mandating government support for community kitchens. So I'd love to hear from you. Have you seen emerging, and again, similarly in Toronto, right? Toronto Black Food Sovereignty Alliance. So essentially what they did was they politicized the question of the difficulties of access of communities of color to healthy and appropriate food, took it to the Toronto City Council, got a mandate, right? They built that collective power, and therefore they got the resources to provide some of this more sustainable funding, this longer term partnerships. Have you seen emerge among your members, your volunteers, something that you might sort of identify as a kind of emergent collective consciousness that could turn into a social movement? Because, you know, Santi, as you were saying, the Action Learning Set with Affordable Food Project showed what could be done. It won't happen unless there's political pressure. That political pressure depends on kind of amazing innovators like you and like the people you've interviewed, but it also depends on a movement, or at least that's the model from Brazil and Canada to a certain extent. Have you seen that emerging? If so, how, and what do you see, what shape it might take in the future? Thanks.
Thank you. That was all brilliant. Thank you so much. And I was just struck by something that Ronnie said about the kind of what the ask of government is if we know what it is. And I think, because I think you said it's, you know, they even need to kind of step up with the kind of level of resources that they did during COVID, or they need to come up with some other kind of solution. But just I was quite struck by that graph that Lydia, you showed at the beginning, which showed actually how food insecurity did drop off a bit, or quite a bit during COVID. So what level of resources did that take to kind of, I know that was distributed through local authorities, and that you know, it wasn't just a kind of centrally controlled scheme. There was a lot of kind of ability to distribute through these different networks. So it seemed like quite a good way of doing it. But what kind of level of resources are we asking for? And I guess in relation to Alex's question, and this is something that we find internationally, there's a big focus on, there's always a lot of campaigns around school meals, and we see that internationally, we see that in the UK. That seems to get the kind of the national attention and the media attention, which I think is a good thing, because we do need to fund school meals. But I just wonder why it is this kind of broader impetus for funding for wider food provision is not getting through as a kind of public campaigning point. So similar to Alex's point there as well. But
there was 2 questions.
For a minute.
So thanks very much for the question. And funny you would say that, Alex. A friend, colleague of mine, Carl Walker, recently came up with a report, some might be aware, called Moral Injury, about the impact of volunteering in food support sector and the difficulties in the sector for volunteers and the lack of representation. And he's putting together, if you want, a movement to address exactly this issue. I guess one of the challenges is the very ad hoc-ish nature of food support in this country, and the very diverse nature of the volunteers. I think that's one kind of impeding element. But I would like to say that movements are taking place on this, and I'm happy to discuss that kind of in more details afterwards if anyone's interested.
Question around the.
Well, I guess what's interesting is we know of solutions in other countries which seem to work. I guess the problem in this country has always been a lack of a clear strategy or vision. The Dimbleby report put a number of ideas forward. The government simply has to decide one way or another what it wants, and it seems to be trying to not decide and not make a kind of a clear commitment either way. It's a kind of a muddling ad hoc-ish, and it might well be because of uncertainty and other issues. So simply on the issue of, let's say, surplus food, some countries mandate that supermarkets or wholesalers have to provide X amount of food for food support. That's a very small thing. The government can decide, for example, that it wants to stimulate more grassroots collaboration. That's something that Brighton Hove Food Partnership are moving towards, making sure food support organizations work better together, joint purchasing, finding storage spaces together, working together on issues of volunteers and staff members. We're doing something similar in Lewis, sharing paid staff members across several organizations. We can't afford to give a full-time job to anyone, but we can afford to pay 1 or 2 or 3 days to somebody. And if someone else can pick the rest of those days, we have created a job. So I think there are solutions. We know what they are, but there has to be some commitment to move in a particular direction.
In terms of the political activism, I would say that Pete here, who is our one of our coordinators, he always rates our tea breaks, and that's where the good conversations happen. We really try and make sure that the people that work with us, volunteer with us, are connected into the local opportunities, and so it's not just about the literally putting veg in a box. It's a kind of wider conversation about where the food is coming from, who gets access to it, how it works. And we've been trying to regularly kind of consult in our local area about what would you like to see, and give people that sense that there can be action on the ground, and that can lead to longer term change, rather because there is a kind of overarching feel of that we can't change anything. We know it's shit, but we can't change anything is a kind of a local feeling. And actually we've had a lot of community members kind of reinforce the idea that actually by connecting with us, they felt like they could change things, or that it was possible to kind of work towards the changes they wanted to see. So that obviously needs to be stepped up. And I think that kind of representation is important. But yeah, so those conversations are certainly happening, and they're happening in quite a natural way on the ground. And I think it's encouraging those and then getting people to think about, so what's next then, you know, and having the capacity to develop that and connect together. Yeah. And in terms of kind of like government support and that kind of thing, you know, there's a lot that could happen, you know, if you invested in a community kitchen in every area, for example, you know, people would come together and cook together, and that would tackle a lot of social issues. I'm thinking about the children's centres and things, you know, there are things you can put in communities to support food insecurity. If you helped with a distribution centre in every community as well, you know, like we were talking about with the food factory, that's an ongoing thing with all the affordable food projects. You know, sometimes you're offered a huge amount of, say, apples on a Friday, and you haven't got a project until the Wednesday. So what do you do with them? Do they end up on your drive often, or whatever? You know, like there's you know, people are just trying to squirrel things away in the places that they've got. And for ourselves, we haven't actually got a base. We're very local food hubs because we've been transporting from one community setting to another, and we've had to, and we're basically just renting a community hall, and we have to get out of there and pretend we didn't exist afterwards, because there's a tea dance straight afterwards, you know. So actually creating spaces in communities for these things to happen would be really helpful. That doesn't fully answer the question, but there's some ideas. So.
I think not from a Chum perspective I'm talking about now, but talking from a Brighton Hove Food Partnership perspective. I think in terms of like grassroots political activism, like that is something that, in terms of like that energy from like the people that are attending it, those things, I wouldn't say that it is as developed as what you're talking about in Canada and Brazil. But in terms of networks and partnerships between organizations and projects, that's something that the Food Partnership obviously is really working on. And in terms of like the Emergency Food Network, which is the collaboration of all the community food projects in the city, having regular meetings, having even just a WhatsApp group where you can be like, there's loads of food here, let's go and collect it. I mean, one that came up on Monday even was Marks and Spencer's, because of that hack that happened recently, had loads and loads of surplus food because their system went kind of, it went wrong and they just kept getting delivered way too much stuff. And then as part of the Emergency Food Network, we had different projects around the city that could pick up stuff on different days and distribute it to other community groups. And then there's the Good Food Procurement Group, which is about getting large caterers, like at the football stadium over there, at the Amex, or kind of restaurants and like large kind of like catering companies to procure better food, like buy better food, buy better quality food. And then also there's a new project, well, it's not a new, it's about a year old now, but it's funded for 4 years, which is the Food Use Places project, which is about reducing food waste and reducing packaging waste in Brighton generally, but within community food projects. And that's 15 projects working together. So they're all quite large groups of projects working together. And obviously the Food Partnership creates reports every year, creates this food strategy action plans to like push all the things we learn from those different networks and those projects and push them to government, to councils to make changes. And obviously some changes happen. I was talking to our director, Vic, the other day, and she said that 10 years ago, it was a challenge just to get them to talk about food, you know, in their policy, in their strategies, just food to even be a afterthought in any conversations around kind of local government and the local council and making decisions. So there has been improvement. And, you know, you see, I think you mentioned the graph during COVID, you see that was a time where there was food was a bit more talked about. There was more political activism, even someone like, you know, Marcus Rashford putting that pressure on the government. And then they did put more money into community food projects, and there was more money to distribute for the Chomp families or for the, and then there was more, and even like local people were more willing to buy and gift one. So that went to a local family. So I don't think there's that political kind of activism at that grassroots that you're talking about as strong as in those countries. But there is definitely projects working together in a much more efficient way than even 5 or 10 years ago to tackle the challenges and put pressure on local government and government nationally. And obviously these action plans and these things do contribute to wider kind of national discussions like Food Matters, who are our sister organization, get involved in as well.
Yeah, I can just talk briefly about the Brighton Hove Food Partnership because I didn't talk about it as much earlier, but I think a driving force before the original idea of this food distribution network was to create kind of a space for a political movement to occur. And it kind of goes to what Sara is saying about a lack of physical space. I think the founder of Brighton Hove Food Factory really saw part of his mission was to create these like physical spaces where people could gather, have facilities, do what they would like to do with the space, the food, the facilities, and to kind of through that build political movement, but first by having the physical resources to do so. So I think when we talk about a distribution network now, that's also kind of the background idea behind it. So I think the appetite and the idea is definitely there, even though that didn't come to fruition for that particular project. And even in terms of the government, I know another idea behind bringing food from farms to the Brighton community was to kind of bring those farms into procurement. If there's funding available from the government, funding available from different community projects, how do we get these farms available and like knowing that they are part of that network? So I think procurement was part of that goal, I guess, on a smaller scale.
Wonderful. We're 5 minutes over time, so thanks very much for staying with us. We have to bring this to a close, but the conversation can continue with those of us in the room. I would like to thank you very much, all our speakers and chair, for a brilliant session, really insightful. And just to note that we have another paper coming up, another working paper coming up that actually addresses the point that Alex was raising, makes international, the connections between the Brighton Hove story with what we've observed in Toronto, São Paulo, as well as in France and South Africa. So we're bringing different perspectives. So that's coming up as part of the Food Equity Center working paper series. And our next scheduled Food Equity Center seminar is on the 15th of July, and it will be focused on power relationships and aquaculture livelihoods in Vietnam. So you're all invited to join us. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you all.